On the afternoon of January 22nd, 2024, an elderly woman named Janet Lee sat in front of her computer in an office on the second floor of her home in Newcastle, England. She was going over some recent bank statements, but it was kind of hard. She was distracted because all she could hear was her boyfriend downstairs talking to someone. So Janet's boyfriend was a guy named Richard O'Connell, and he and Janet had been together for about 20 years. Now, despite not officially being married, they sort of functioned like a married couple. In fact, Janet had even written Richard into her will. As Janet sat upstairs trying to do these bank statements, but getting completely sidetracked just by the sound of Richard's voice, she suddenly hears Richard start yelling downstairs. And at first, it kind of sounded like maybe he was yelling at the person he had been talking to. But the more Janet listened, she could tell it really wasn't that he was yelling as much as he was screaming, like he was screaming out in pain or something. And so Janet got out of her chair and ran downstairs to see what was going on. And when she did, she looked towards the front door and she saw there was this man who she didn't recognize, but he looked weirdly familiar to her. He was wearing a white lab coat, his back was to her, and he was walking out the front door. And before she could even begin to process who this guy was and what he was doing here, she heard the sound of Richard again kind of calling out in pain. Then she turned and sure enough, there was Richard in the living room, clutching his shoulder and grimacing. She walked over to him and she's like, "What's going on? Like, what's wrong with you? And who was that guy?" And so Richard, through gritted teeth, would tell her that he had just gotten a COVID vaccine shot and it really hurt. And that guy who had just given it to him was a guy from NHS, the National Health Service, and he just came by to administer the shot. And so Janet heard what he said, but it wasn't really computing. Like, why aren't you getting the shot done at the doctor's office? 2 days later, Janet did end up driving Richard to the hospital. Hospital doctors would diagnose Richard with something called necrotizing fasciitis, which is a bacterial infection more commonly known as flesh-eating disease. Basically, the skin and muscle of Richard's arm was dying and rotting, but from the inside out. Over the course of this discussion that Janet is listening to as well, Richard began describing the NHS guy who had actually come to his house. But now, as she's listening to Richard describe this NHS guy with a little more detail this time, suddenly something clicked. It would turn out this man's name was Thomas Kwan. Thomas Kwan was Janet's son. And he was furious at her for putting Richard in her will and allowing Richard to get her house when she died. But Richard would survive the ordeal. He would have to undergo several pretty intense surgeries, but he ended up being okay. As for Thomas, he was arrested and convicted of attempted murder and sentenced to 31 years in prison.